The world of crime is often associated with violence, chaos, and reckless decision-making. But some criminals rise above the rest, not through brute force, but through strategy, discipline, and an almost corporate-level understanding of business. These are the masterminds, the ones who don't just survive in the underworld but dominate it, building empires that rival Fortune 500 companies. Among them, one name stands out: Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Unlike the stereotypical kingpin, El Chapo didn't come from wealth, nor was he groomed for leadership. He was born into poverty in the rugged mountains of Sinaloa, Mexico. His father was a cattle rancher, and like many in the region, he also dabbled in opium poppy cultivation. But El Chapo's early years were marked by hardship. School was never a priority. By the time he was a teenager, he had already dropped out to help support his family. Yet, even then, there were signs of something different about him. He wasn't just another poor kid trying to make ends meet. He had ambition, a hunger that set him apart from his peers. And in the mountains of Sinaloa, where drug trafficking was a way of life, that ambition would find its outlet. By his early 20s, El Chapo was working for Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, one of the most powerful drug traffickers in Mexico at the time. Gallardo, known as the godfather of the Mexican drug trade, ran the infamous Guadalajara cartel. Under his rule, the business of smuggling drugs into the United States was evolving. What was once a chaotic operation run by loosely connected gangs was becoming a sophisticated, well-oiled machine. El Chapo was a small player at first, handling logistics and ensuring drug shipments reached their destinations. But he quickly proved himself invaluable. He wasn't just reliable, he was innovative. He understood the importance of efficiency and secrecy. Where others saw obstacles, he saw solutions. When Colombian suppliers needed new routes to smuggle cocaine into the US, El Chapo devised a method that would change the game forever: tunnels. The tunnels beneath the US-Mexico border were a stroke of genius. They allowed traffickers to move massive quantities of drugs while avoiding border security. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were professionally engineered passageways, complete with ventilation, electricity, and rail systems. It was a testament to El Chapo's vision. While others relied on bribing officials or hiding drugs in vehicles, he built an infrastructure. But his real rise to power came in 1989 when Gallardo was arrested. With the Guadalajara cartel leader out of the picture, a power vacuum emerged. The once unified cartel fractured into separate factions, each controlled by ambitious lieutenants. Among them was El Chapo, who took control of what would become the Sinaloa cartel. He wasted no time expanding. Unlike other cartel leaders who sought to dominate through sheer brutality, El Chapo approached the drug trade like a businessman. He formed alliances, diversified operations, and ensured a steady supply chain. He negotiated directly with Colombian producers, cutting out middlemen and increasing profit margins. He established distribution networks in the US, working with American gangs to push his product. By the late 1990s, El Chapo's cartel was responsible for the majority of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine entering the US. His empire stretched across continents, with operations in South America, Europe, and even Asia. The money flowed in billions of dollars in annual revenue. Forbes even listed him as one of the richest men in the world. But with success came enemies. The Mexican government, under pressure from the US, intensified its war on drugs. In 1993, El Chapo was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but prison, as he would prove, was just another obstacle to overcome. In 2001, after serving just 8 years, he pulled off one of the most infamous prison escapes in history. With the help of bribed guards, he was smuggled out of his cell, hidden inside a laundry cart. Just like that, the world's most powerful drug lord was back in business. His return marked a new chapter of violence. The drug trade had changed in his absence. Rival cartels had grown stronger, and the fight for territory turned Mexico into a war zone. The conflict between the Sinaloa cartel and the Zetas, a paramilitary-style cartel, resulted in some of the most brutal violence Mexico had ever seen. Cities became battlegrounds. Entire police forces were assassinated. Corpses were left hanging from bridges as warnings. Yet, Through it all, El Chapo remained untouchable. He lived like a ghost, constantly moving, protected by layers of security and an army of loyal soldiers. His cartel wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a government within itself, complete with its own intelligence network, financial system, and military force. Then, in 2014, the impossible happened. He was captured again. This time, he was taken to Mexico's most secure prison, Altiplano. The government vowed that there would be no escape. But El Chapo had other plans. In 2015, he pulled off an even more audacious escape. His men had spent months digging a tunnel, more than a mile long, from a nearby warehouse straight into his prison cell. The tunnel had lighting, ventilation, and even a motorcycle on rails to transport him faster. When the moment came, he simply climbed into the tunnel and disappeared. For another year, he remained free. He even granted an interview to actor Sean Penn, an act of arrogance that would contribute to his downfall. In 2016, Mexican authorities finally caught up with him again, and this time, there would be no escape. He was extradited to the US, where he faced trial in New York. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Former cartel members testified, detailing the inner workings of his empire. Financial records, intercepted communications, and eyewitness accounts painted the picture of a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise through strategy, violence, and relentless ambition. In 2019, he was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. Today, El Chapo sits in the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility ADX, in Colorado, one of the most secure prisons in the world. His empire, however, lives on. The Sinaloa cartel remains one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, now controlled by a new generation of leaders. His story is one of both brilliance and destruction. He wasn't just a drug dealer. He was a strategist, a businessman, and a manipulator who turned an illegal operation into a global empire. He built tunnels, smuggled billions in narcotics, and ran his cartel like a corporate CEO, outmaneuvering rivals and law enforcement alike. But while El Chapo sat in his high-security cell, the organization he built remained far from dismantled. The Sinaloa cartel, a billion-dollar empire, did not crumble upon his imprisonment. If anything, it adapted, evolving like a corporate entity undergoing leadership changes. Guzman had spent decades establishing a network so vast and efficient that no single arrest could bring it down. Even behind bars, whispers of his influence persisted. Reports emerged of guards being bribed, of secret messages making their way to his lieutenants. But the new leadership, his sons, known as Los Chapitos, and longtime associate Ismael El Mayo Zambada, understood that the cartel's survival depended on moving forward without relying on its former king. El Mayo had always been different from El Chapo. While Guzman thrived in the spotlight, El Mayo was a shadow, an enigma who had never spent a day in prison. He preferred to lead from the background, ensuring the cartel functioned like a well-oiled machine. Under his guidance, the Sinaloa cartel diversified its operations, increasing its grip on fentanyl production, a drug that proved far deadlier and more profitable than cocaine or heroin. As El Mayo ensured the cartel's global operations remained intact, the younger generation, the sons of El Chapo, operated with more recklessness. Unlike their father, who built his empire through careful alliances and negotiation, Los Chapitos were known for their impulsive brutality. They leaned heavily on violence, making enemies quickly and attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement. But even as internal tensions simmered, the cartel remained the dominant force in the global drug trade. U.S. authorities estimated that up to a quarter of the illegal drugs entering the country still came from Sinaloa's supply chain. New trafficking routes emerged, spanning from Mexico to Europe, Africa, and even Australia. The empire was no longer just about the Americas, it was global. Yet the world was changing. Governments across North and South America had ramped up efforts to combat organized crime. Technology, once a tool used by cartels to evade detection, was now being used against them. AI-powered surveillance, satellite tracking, and cyber intelligence made it harder for traffickers to operate unnoticed. Still, the cartel adapted. Encrypted communication apps, cryptocurrency laundering, and deep web marketplaces became the new battlegrounds. Gone were the days of crude smuggling tactics. This was a new era of cyber-savvy criminals who understood that the future of crime wasn't just in the streets but in the digital world. The cartel's finances remained one of its strongest weapons. With billions of dollars flowing through its channels, corruption was inevitable. Officials at every level, from local police officers to high-ranking politicians, were on the payroll. The cartel's money bought silence, cooperation, and sometimes even loyalty. But while the Sinaloa cartel continued its dominance, a new challenge arose. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, led by Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera, was rising rapidly, threatening Sinaloa's long-held supremacy. Unlike El Chapo's empire, which operated with a mix of diplomacy and aggression, CJNG embraced unrelenting violence as its primary tool. CJNG operatives attacked police forces head-on, shot down military helicopters, and openly challenged the government. Their brutality made headlines, and their rapid expansion forced Sinaloa to rethink its strategies. A full-scale war between the two cartels loomed, with battles erupting in multiple states across Mexico. Meanwhile, the U.S. government continued its efforts to dismantle cartel operations. The DEA, FBI, and Homeland Security intensified crackdowns on cartel assets, targeting money laundering schemes and front businesses. Every dollar seized was a blow to the empire, but no matter how many millions were confiscated, billions more remained hidden. El Chapo's trial, dubbed the Trial of the Century, exposed the inner workings of the cartel in ways never seen before. Testimonies from former associates painted a picture of unimaginable wealth, corruption, and savagery. Yet, even as the world watched, many knew that imprisoning one man would not end the drug trade. The reality was simple: demand drove supply. As long as there were users in the US and beyond, there would always be suppliers willing to risk everything to feed that demand. The war on drugs had been waged for decades, costing billions of dollars and countless lives. Yet the cycle continued. The brutality of the cartel's operations was undeniable. The mass graves, the villages left in terror, the journalists silenced for reporting the truth. It was a reign of fear that extended far beyond the drug trade. For many in Mexico, the cartels were more powerful than the government itself. Entire towns relied on cartel money for survival. They built roads, provided jobs, and even funded social programs. In some regions, locals viewed cartel leaders not as criminals but as protectors, filling the gaps left by a failing system. Yet, for every act of generosity, there were 10 acts of destruction. The violence left scars that would last generations. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, entire communities displaced by the endless war between rival factions. El Chapo's capture and conviction were symbolic victories for law enforcement. But in the grand scheme of things, little changed. His cartel was still active. The drug trade was still thriving. The violence was still escalating. And while the world moved on to new headlines, new crises, and new villains, the empire he built remained. A shadow empire that no prison walls could truly contain. Some speculated about El Chapo's fate behind bars. Would he ever escape again? Would he spend his final days isolated in a concrete cell, cut off from the empire he once ruled? Or would his legend only grow in his absence, fueling the rise of new figures who sought to follow in his footsteps? What was clear was that crime itself was evolving. The old-school drug lords, the ones who built their empires through smuggling routes and direct negotiations, were being replaced by tech-savvy, faceless operators. The future of organized crime was digital, decentralized, and harder to trace. Money laundering now ran through cryptocurrencies, making tracking transactions nearly impossible. The dark web allowed illicit deals to happen without face-to-face meetings. And while authorities scrambled to keep up, criminals always seemed one step ahead. The rise of synthetic drugs like fentanyl further shifted the landscape. Unlike cocaine or heroin, which relied on large-scale farming and transportation, synthetic drugs could be manufactured in small labs, making them harder to detect and easier to distribute. For the new generation of traffickers, the lessons of El Chapo's empire were clear. Stay in the shadows, embrace technology, and never believe you are untouchable. Yet, in the streets of Sinaloa, his name still carried weight. Songs were written about him, murals bore his face. To some, he was a villain, to others, a legend. But no matter how history remembers him, the truth remains. He was a man who built a criminal empire worth billions, reshaped the global drug trade, and left behind a world forever altered by his ambition. And as one chapter closes, another begins. Somewhere, someone else is building their own empire, learning from the past, and preparing to take their place in the underworld. The question is not whether the next kingpin will rise, but when and how much more powerful they will become. But in the end, his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness, his belief that he was untouchable. No empire lasts forever, and no king remains on the throne forever. The question now is not whether another El Chapo will rise, but rather, how many are already building their own empires in the shadows, waiting for their turn to rule.